The morning of April 7th, 2014 dawned gray and unremarkable over the English countryside. But within the walls of a converted farmhouse in Wrotham, Kent, time had stopped forever. 25-year-old Peaches Geldof lay motionless in an upstairs bedroom, her long blonde hair spread across rumpled sheets, her face bearing the serene expression of someone who had finally found peace. In the rooms below, her two young sons, Astala, aged 2, and Phaedra, just 11 months old, waited unknowingly for a mother who would never wake again. The scene that greeted police officers was hauntingly familiar to those who remembered another April day 14 years earlier, when addiction had claimed another life in this same family. Empty syringes lay scattered on nearby surfaces, traces of heroin residue marking the final chapter of a life that had burned too bright and too fast. The official cause of death would read like a terrible echo from the past. Acute heroin intoxication, the same demon that had taken her mother, Paula Yates, in September 2000. But as news of Peaches' death spread across London's media landscape like wildfire, questions began to emerge that would haunt her family and friends for years to come. How does a young woman who had everything, fame, beauty, a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, and a future full of possibilities, end up dead from the same addiction that destroyed her mother? Was this really just another tragic case of celebrity excess, or was something far more sinister at work? A generational curse that seemed determined to claim every woman in the Geldof family. The final Instagram post on Peaches' account showed a black and white photograph of herself as a child, nestled in her mother Paula's arms, both of them smiling with the innocent joy of a simpler time. The caption read simply, "Me and my mummy." Posted just days before her death, the image seemed to carry an ominous weight, as if Peaches knew she was about to join her mother in whatever realm exists beyond this life. In the hours following the discovery of her body, London's celebrity establishment reeled with shock and disbelief. This was Peaches Geldof, the wild child who had defined cool for an entire generation, the fearless columnist who spoke truth to power, the devoted mother who had seemed to find stability after years of chaos. How could someone so vibrant, so alive, so seemingly in control of her destiny simply vanish into the darkness that had claimed so many before her? The world mourned the loss of their beloved it-girl, but they never truly understood the torment that lurked beneath her perfectly curated social media presence. Behind the designer clothes, the witty observations, and the picture-perfect family photos lay a young woman trapped by the weight of her lineage, fighting a battle she had inherited before she was old enough to understand the rules. But to understand how it all ended in that quiet farmhouse bedroom, we must first understand how it all began in the chaotic glamour of 1980s London. Peaches Honeyblossom Geldof entered the world on March 13, 1989. Born into a family where fame was not an aspiration but a birthright, and where the line between public performance and private reality had long since been erased. Her father, Bob Geldof, was at the height of his influence as both a rock star and humanitarian activist, while her mother, Paula Yates, reigned as the queen of British television, her irreverent interview style and magnetic personality making her one of the most recognizable faces in the country. The Geldof household in the late 1980s was a swirling vortex of celebrity visitors, media attention, and creative chaos. Bob's work with Band Aid and Live Aid had transformed him from a punk rocker into a global humanitarian icon, while Paula's career on shows like The Tube and The Big Breakfast had made her the face of cool Britannia. Their home became a salon where musicians, artists, politicians, and media personalities gathered to debate, create, and indulge in the excesses that defined the era. For young Peaches, this environment was simply normal life. She grew up surrounded by rock stars and television personalities, learned to navigate media attention before she could properly read, and absorbed the complex dynamics of fame and creativity that would shape her entire worldview. Her earliest memories were soundtracked by her father's music and punctuated by the flash of paparazzi cameras that followed the family wherever they went. But beneath the glittering surface of this bohemian lifestyle lay deeper currents that would prove prophetic. Paula's relationship with fame was complicated and often destructive. She craved attention but resented its intrusions, loved the creative energy of the media world but struggled with its demands for constant performance. These contradictions would echo through Peach's own relationship with celebrity culture, in ways that became tragically apparent only in retrospect. The family dynamic shifted dramatically in Peach's early childhood, as her parents' marriage began to fracture under the pressures of fame, conflicting personalities, and Bob's increasing involvement in humanitarian causes that took him away from home for extended periods. Paula's attention began to wander toward other projects and relationships, creating an atmosphere of instability that affected all the children, but seemed to impact Peaches most profoundly. Even in these early years, there were signs that Peaches possessed an unusual intelligence and sensitivity that set her apart from other children. She absorbed adult conversations with remarkable comprehension, displayed an precocious understanding of complex social dynamics, and showed an early fascination with the darker aspects of human nature that worried some of the adults around her. Teachers noted her exceptional verbal abilities, but also her tendency toward mood swings and her difficulty forming stable friendships with peers. Could their early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? In Peach's case, the very environment that would later make her a natural fit for celebrity culture. The constant scrutiny, the expectation of performance, the blurred boundaries between public and private life, also created psychological patterns that would ultimately contribute to her destruction. The catalyst that would reshape Peach's entire existence came in 1995 when she was just 6 years old, as her mother Paula embarked on a relationship with INXS frontman Michael Hutchence that would tear the Geldof family apart and set in motion a series of events that would cast shadows over the rest of Peach's life. The affair began during Paula's interview with Hutchence for The Big Breakfast, and the sexual chemistry between them was immediately obvious to everyone on set. The breakdown of her parents' marriage played out in the most public arena imaginable, with every detail dissected by tabloid newspapers hungry for scandal involving two of Britain's most recognizable celebrities. For Peaches, the experience of watching her family disintegrate while millions of strangers read intimate details about her parents' lives created a complex relationship with publicity that would define her approach to fame for the rest of her life. The custody battle that followed was particularly brutal, with Bob fighting to maintain access to his children while Paula became increasingly erratic and unpredictable in her behavior. Peaches found herself caught between two powerful personalities who were using the media as weapons in their personal war, learning at an impossibly young age how fame could be both a tool and a curse depending on how it was wielded. The move to Australia with Paula and Michael Hutchence represented a complete upheaval of everything Peaches had known. Sydney in the mid-1990s was a world away from London's media landscape, but the chaos of her family life only intensified as Paula and Michael's relationship became increasingly destructive. Both were struggling with substance abuse issues, and their home life became a cycle of passionate reconciliations and explosive arguments that left the children feeling perpetually unstable. For Peaches, this period was formative in ways that would echo through her entire adult life. She learned to navigate the emotional volatility of adults whose behavior was unpredictable and often dangerous, developed survival mechanisms that prioritized adaptability over authenticity, and began to understand that love and pain were often inextricably linked in the world of the adults she depended on. The tragedy that struck in November 1997 when Michael Hutchence was found dead in his Sydney hotel room sent shockwaves through Peach's already unstable world. At just 8 years old, she was forced to process not only the death of her stepfather, but also the complete psychological collapse of her mother, who never recovered from the loss of the man she considered the love of her life. The return to London that followed represented another complete reinvention of Peach's reality. Paula's mental health deteriorated rapidly after Michael's death, and her increasing reliance on prescription medications and alcohol created an environment where the children were often left to fend for themselves. Peaches began to take on responsibilities far beyond her years, caring for her younger sisters and trying to manage her mother's increasingly erratic behavior. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? For Peaches, success was never really the goal. Survival was. The skills she developed during this chaotic period, the ability to read adult emotions, to perform whatever version of herself was needed in any given moment, to find stability in instability, would later serve her well in the entertainment industry, but they came at enormous psychological cost. By the time Peaches entered her teenage years in the early 2000s, she had already lived through more trauma and upheaval than most people experience in a lifetime. The death of her mother from a heroin overdose in September 2000, when Peaches was just 11 years old, represented the final collapse of any semblance of normal childhood and thrust her into a world where she would be defined primarily by her losses rather than her potential. The media coverage of Paula's death was relentless and invasive, with newspapers competing to publish the most intimate details of her final days and the circumstances that led to her overdose. For Peaches, the experience of watching her mother's death become public entertainment was deeply traumatizing and created a lifelong ambivalence about the media attention that followed her wherever she went. Returning to live with Bob Geldof represented a chance for stability, but it also meant adapting to yet another completely different family dynamic. Bob's approach to parenting was vastly different from Paula's bohemian chaos, more structured and disciplined, but also more emotionally distant. Peaches found herself struggling to connect with a father who had been largely absent during her early childhood and who now seemed like a stranger. The transition to life as a grieving celebrity teenager in London's social scene was fraught with complications. Peaches was simultaneously seeking normal adolescent experiences and trying to process profound trauma, all while being followed by photographers documenting her every move. The combination of inherited fame, recent tragedy, and typical teenage rebellion created a perfect storm that would define her public persona for years to come. Her early ventures into writing and journalism provided an outlet for her intelligence and wit, but they also exposed her to adult worlds of party culture and media manipulation that she was emotionally unprepared to navigate. The precocious teenager who could hold her own in conversations with established journalists and cultural critics was still a child dealing with abandonment, loss, and the complex legacy of her famous parents. The pressure to live up to her family's legacy while simultaneously escaping its shadow created impossible contradictions in Peaches' developing sense of self. She was expected to be sophisticated enough to represent the Geldof name in public, but young enough to be controlled and protected by the adults around her. She needed to be interesting enough to maintain media attention, but not so controversial as to damage her father's reputation. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? Paula's death was certainly the defining trauma of Peaches' life, but it also revealed patterns of addiction, mental illness, and destructive behavior that ran through multiple generations of her family, suggesting that her later struggles were as much about inherited predisposition as they were about environmental factors. The transformation of Peaches Geldof from grieving child to London's most notorious it girl happened with breathtaking speed once she reached her mid-teens. By 15, she was writing a regular column for Elle Girl magazine, offering opinions on fashion, culture, and politics with a confidence and edge that belied her young age. Her natural wit, combined with the cachet of her famous name and the sympathy generated by her tragic backstory, made her an irresistible commodity for publishers and editors seeking to capture the attention of young readers. But success came with a price that Peaches was poorly equipped to pay. The constant scrutiny of her appearance, opinions, and personal life created enormous pressure to maintain a persona that was both authentic to her experiences and palatable to mass audiences. The young woman who had learned to survive by adapting to the emotional needs of unstable adults now found herself performing for millions of strangers who felt entitled to judge every aspect of her existence. Her emergence into London's party scene coincided with a cultural moment when celebrity culture was becoming increasingly democratized through the internet and reality television. Peaches became one of the first generation of famous for being famous personalities, whose every outfit, relationship, and public appearance generated headlines and social media buzz. The skills she had developed for navigating family chaos served her well in this environment, but they also prevented her from developing a stable sense of self outside of performance. The relationships she formed during this period were often complicated by the power dynamics inherent in her celebrity status. Friends, romantic partners, and professional associates all had to navigate the reality that association with Peaches brought both opportunities and risks, creating an environment where it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine affection and strategic networking. Her romantic relationships in particular became subject to intense media scrutiny that turned private moments into public entertainment. Every breakup, every argument, every intimate gesture was photographed, analyzed, and reported on by publications hungry for content about one of London's most visible young women. The normal process of learning about love and relationships became impossibly complicated by the knowledge that mistakes would be documented and judged by strangers. The fashion world embraced Peaches as a muse and style icon, celebrating her ability to mix high-end designer pieces with vintage finds and street fashion in ways that felt both effortless and revolutionary. Her image appeared on magazine covers and fashion spreads, and her personal style influenced trends among young women across Britain and beyond. But the constant focus on her appearance also created pressure to maintain an impossible standard of perfection. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The answer became increasingly obvious to those close to Peaches as her public success grew. The more famous she became, the more isolated she felt from authentic human connection. The very qualities that made her compelling to audiences. Her intelligence, her vulnerability, her tragic backstory, also made her feel like a commodity rather than a person. The wild years that followed were marked by increasingly erratic behavior as Peaches struggled to balance her public persona with her private pain. The party scene that had initially provided escape and social connection gradually became another form of performance, where she was expected to be the most outrageous, the most quotable, the most photographable person in every room she entered. Substance use, which had begun as typical teenage experimentation, started to serve different purposes in Peaches' life. Alcohol and drugs provided temporary relief from anxiety and depression, but they also helped her maintain the larger-than-life personality that audiences expected. The line between recreational use and dependency became increasingly blurred as her lifestyle demanded constant chemical enhancement of her natural energy and charisma. The constant cycle of work, parties, and media appearances left little time for reflection or genuine rest. Peaches' schedule was managed by agents and publicists who viewed her primarily as a brand to be maximized rather than a young person who needed guidance and support. The adults around her were invested in maintaining her marketability rather than her well-being, creating an environment where destructive behavior was often enabled rather than addressed. Media coverage of her exploits oscillated between celebration and condemnation, often within the same publication. She was simultaneously praised for her fearlessness and criticized for her recklessness, admired for her authenticity and condemned for her mistakes. This constant whiplash of public opinion created enormous stress and made it even more difficult for Peaches to develop a stable sense of self-worth. The pressure to constantly produce content, whether through her journalism, her public appearances, or her social media presence, meant that every aspect of her life became potential material for public consumption. Privacy became a luxury she could rarely afford, and spontaneity was always filtered through considerations of how moments would be perceived and reported on by others. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Peaches, the shadow cast by her family's tragedies seemed to grow longer rather than shorter as she aged, and the coping mechanisms she had developed to survive childhood trauma were proving inadequate for managing adult responsibilities and expectations. The late 2000s and early 2010s marked a period of growing desperation in Peaches' life, as the lifestyle that had once provided excitement and validation began to feel like a trap from which she couldn't escape. The financial crisis had impacted the media industry, making work less reliable, while the rise of social media had intensified the pressure for constant content creation and public engagement. Her attempts to branch out into different types of work, television presenting, music, fashion design, met with mixed success and often harsh criticism from audiences and critics who preferred her to remain in the carefully defined box of it girl columnist. The same media that had celebrated her precocious talent now seemed determined to limit her growth and evolution as an artist and thinker. Personal relationships became increasingly difficult to maintain, as Peaches' substance use escalated and her emotional volatility increased. Friends described her as brilliant and hilarious when she was clean, but unpredictable and sometimes cruel when she was using. The warm, vulnerable person who existed beneath the public persona was becoming harder to access as defensive mechanisms built up over years of scrutiny and trauma became more entrenched. The death of Amy Winehouse in July 2011 sent shockwaves through London's creative community and served as a stark reminder of the dangers facing young women in the entertainment industry who struggled with addiction. For Peaches, Amy's death was particularly resonant. Both women were London artists from famous families, both struggled with substance abuse, and both had been simultaneously celebrated and exploited by the media that claimed to love them. Financial pressures added another layer of stress to Peaches' situation. Despite her fame and apparent success, the irregular nature of media work and her expensive lifestyle meant that money was often a source of anxiety. The trust funds and financial support that might have provided security came with strings attached and constant oversight that felt invasive and controlling. The emergence of new social media platforms created additional pressure to maintain relevance and engagement with audiences who had ever shorter attention spans and ever higher expectations for entertainment. Peaches found herself competing not just with other celebrities but with millions of ordinary people who were creating content and building audiences online. The democratization of fame that had initially benefited her career now threatened to make her obsolete. Sleep became increasingly elusive as anxiety and stimulant use created cycles of insomnia and exhaustion that made it difficult to maintain the energy needed for public appearances and work commitments. The pharmaceutical solutions offered by doctors often created additional problems, as prescription medications interacted poorly with recreational drugs and alcohol. Her relationship with food became another battleground as the pressure to maintain a certain appearance conflicted with the appetite-suppressing effects of stimulants and the emotional eating that often followed periods of drug use. The constant scrutiny of her body by fashion magazines and social media commenters created additional stress and contributed to an unhealthy relationship with nutrition and body image. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? The distinction became increasingly meaningless as Peaches's options narrowed and the gap between her public success and private suffering continued to widen. The period from 2012 to 2014 represented both Peaches's greatest attempt at redemption and her ultimate tragedy, as she struggled to build a stable family life while battling demons that had been growing stronger for more than a decade. Her marriage to musician Thomas Cohen in September 12 was seen by many as a sign that she was finally ready to leave behind the chaos of her party years and embrace a more conventional lifestyle. The birth of her first son, Astala, in April 2012 had already begun to transform Peaches's perspective on life and her priorities. Motherhood awakened protective instincts and gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her previous pursuits. For the first time since childhood, she had someone who needed her not for entertainment or professional services, but for the fundamental care and love that defines the parent-child relationship. The move to the Kent countryside represented a conscious rejection of the London scene that had defined her 20s. The converted farmhouse where she and Thomas made their home was a world away from the glamorous venues and media offices where she had spent most of her adult life. Here she could focus on domestic activities, cooking, gardening, caring for her children, that connected her to more fundamental aspects of human experience. Social media posts from this period showed a different side of Peaches's personality: warm, maternal, domestic. Photos of home-cooked meals, garden flowers, and quiet moments with her children suggested a woman who had found peace and contentment in ordinary family life. The wit and edge that had defined her public persona were still present, but they were now directed toward celebrating simple pleasures rather than courting controversy. The birth of her second son, Phaedra, in April 2013 seemed to complete the picture of domestic bliss that Peaches was trying to create. She spoke frequently in interviews about how motherhood had saved her, given her life meaning, and helped her understand what really mattered. The two boys became the center of her universe, and she threw herself into parenting with the same intensity she had once brought to partying and career building. But beneath the surface of this apparently successful transformation, the underlying issues that had driven Peaches's earlier destructive behavior were never properly addressed. The trauma of her childhood, the addiction patterns she had inherited from her mother, and the psychological damage caused by years of media scrutiny all remained present, temporarily suppressed by the demands of new motherhood but not genuinely healed. The isolation of country life, while providing respite from media attention, also cut Peaches off from the support networks and professional obligations that had previously provided structure to her days. The lack of external validation and intellectual stimulation that had once fed her ego left a void that became increasingly difficult to fill through domestic activities alone. Thomas's work as a musician required him to travel frequently, leaving Peaches alone with two small children for extended periods. The challenges of solo parenting, combined with the sleep deprivation that comes with caring for infants, created stress that made her more vulnerable to the temptations she was trying to resist. The anniversary dates of family tragedies, her mother's death, Michael Hutchins's suicide, other losses that had marked her childhood, continued to trigger periods of depression and anxiety that were difficult to manage without professional help. The stigma around mental health treatment, particularly for someone trying to maintain a public image of recovery and stability, made it difficult for Peaches to seek the support she needed. Financial pressures persisted despite the appearance of domestic stability. The reduced income that came with stepping back from constant media work, combined with the expenses of maintaining a family and rural property, created stress that was often exacerbated by disagreements with Thomas about money management and career priorities. The final weeks of Peaches' life were marked by increasing social media activity that seemed to reflect a growing preoccupation with her family's tragic history. Her posts became more nostalgic and melancholic, frequently featuring photographs from her childhood and references to her mother. The Instagram post showing herself as a child with Paula, published just days before her death, seemed to carry particular emotional weight. On the evening of April 6, 2014, Peaches was alone in the farmhouse with her two young sons while Thomas was working in London. Neighbors later reported that the house appeared quiet and normal, with no signs of distress or unusual activity. The children were put to bed at their usual time, and Peaches settled in for what appeared to be a typical evening of domestic routine. Sometime during the night, in the privacy of her bedroom, Peaches made the decision that would end her life and devastate her family. The heroin she injected was of unusually high purity, causing almost immediate respiratory depression and cardiac arrest. There was no time for second thoughts, no opportunity for rescue, no chance to reconsider the choice that would leave her children motherless and her husband widowed. The discovery of her body the following afternoon sent shockwaves through Britain's celebrity establishment and beyond. Thomas Cohen's statement to police describing finding his wife unresponsive in their bedroom painted a picture of a tragedy that seemed to come without warning. The emergency services that responded to the scene found it impossible to revive her, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. News of Peaches' death dominated British media for weeks, with coverage that ranged from respectful tributes to sensational speculation about the circumstances of her overdose. The revelation that she had died from heroin use, exactly like her mother 14 years earlier, created a narrative of generational curse that captivated public attention while devastating those who loved her. The inquest that followed revealed the full extent of Peaches' secret struggle with addiction, including evidence that she had been using heroin regularly in the months before her death, despite maintaining the appearance of clean living. Text messages recovered from her phone showed communications with drug dealers, contradicting the public image of rural domestic bliss she had been cultivating. Bob Geldof's statement expressing his grief and bewilderment at losing another daughter to the same addiction that had claimed his ex-wife highlighted the cruel repetition of tragedy within the family. His words carried the weight of someone who had watched helplessly as patterns of destruction repeated themselves across generations, despite his best efforts to prevent them. The impact on Thomas Cohen and the couple's young children was devastating and immediate. Suddenly widowed at 23, Thomas found himself facing the challenge of raising two small boys alone while processing his own grief and the public scrutiny that accompanied his wife's death. The children, too young to understand what had happened, would grow up with only photographs and stories to remember their mother. Media coverage of the tragedy often focused on the seeming inevitability of Peaches' fate, treating her death as the predictable conclusion to a family curse, rather than examining the systemic failures that had contributed to her addiction. The narrative of inherited doom, while compelling to audiences, obscured the more complex reality of how trauma, untreated mental illness, and societal pressure had combined to create the conditions for tragedy. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? While there was no evidence of foul play in Peaches' overdose, many observers pointed to the entertainment industry's systematic exploitation of troubled young women as a form of institutional negligence. The forces that killed her were not criminal in the traditional sense, but they were powerful and destructive nonetheless. The pharmaceutical industry's role in her tragedy also deserved scrutiny, as the easy availability of prescription medications had enabled her early experimentation with drugs and created pathways to harder substances. The same medical establishment that was supposed to protect public health had provided many of the tools that facilitated her addiction. Mental health services in Britain, particularly for celebrities and public figures, were revealed to be inadequate for addressing the complex needs of someone with Peach's history and circumstances. The stigma around addiction treatment, combined with privacy concerns and professional considerations, had created barriers to getting help that proved insurmountable. The broader cultural obsession with celebrity self-destruction, which had turned Peach's struggles into entertainment throughout her adult life, was also implicated in her death. The same audiences who claimed to love her had consistently rewarded her most destructive behaviors with attention and engagement, creating perverse incentives that made recovery more difficult. Social media's role in enabling and amplifying harmful behaviors became a particular focus of discussion following her death. The platforms that had allowed Peach's to connect with audiences and express herself creatively had also provided constant temptation for validation-seeking behaviors and had made privacy nearly impossible to maintain. The investigation into her death revealed the sophisticated methods she had used to hide her addiction from family and friends, including separate phone accounts for communicating with dealers and careful timing of drug use to avoid detection. The level of planning and deception required highlighted how consuming and all-encompassing addiction had become in her final months. Child Protection Services conducted extensive reviews of the circumstances surrounding her death, particularly focusing on the welfare of her 2 young sons who had been present in the house when she overdosed. The case highlighted gaps in support systems for families affected by addiction, and the challenges of protecting children when parents are skilled at hiding their substance use. The coroner's findings emphasized that Peach's death was the result of acute heroin intoxication, with no evidence of suicide intent or third-party involvement. However, the ruling also acknowledged the complex factors that had contributed to her addiction, including childhood trauma, genetic predisposition, and environmental stressors that had never been adequately addressed. In the years following her death, Peach's story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers facing young women in the entertainment industry who struggle with inherited trauma and addiction. Her case is frequently cited in discussions about mental health support, addiction treatment, and the responsibility of media organizations toward the vulnerable individuals they profit from covering. Educational institutions have incorporated her story into curricula about media literacy, celebrity culture, and the social determinants of health, using her tragedy as a case study in how multiple risk factors can combine to create devastating outcomes. These academic discussions help ensure that future generations understand the human cost of the entertainment they consume. Thomas Cohen's advocacy work since her death has focused on addiction awareness and support for families affected by substance abuse. His efforts to honor Peach's memory through positive action have helped transform personal tragedy into social benefit, though the cost of this transformation continues to be measured in ongoing grief and loss. Mental health professionals have found important lessons in her story, particularly regarding the unique challenges faced by children of celebrities who inherit both fame and trauma. The complex interplay between genetic predisposition, environmental factors, and social pressures in her case has informed new approaches to treating addiction in high-profile individuals. Today, more than a decade after her death, Peach's Geldof's legacy remains complicated and multifaceted. She is remembered simultaneously as a talented writer and cultural critic, a devoted mother, a cautionary tale about celebrity excess, and a victim of systemic failures in mental health and addiction support. Her image continues to circulate on social media platforms, often accompanied by discussions about the pressures facing young women in the public eye. Documentary filmmakers and journalists continue to examine her life and death, seeking to understand not just what happened to her, but why it happened and what lessons might be learned from her tragedy. Each new exploration reveals additional layers of complexity in the forces that shaped her brief existence and the circumstances that led to her untimely death. The entertainment industry has implemented some reforms inspired by cases like Peaches's, including better mental health support for performers and more ethical guidelines for covering the personal struggles of public figures. However, many advocates argue that more fundamental changes are needed to address the systemic issues that continue to put vulnerable individuals at risk. Her sons, now teenagers, are growing up with the complicated legacy of their mother's fame and tragedy. The challenge of honoring her memory while protecting their own privacy and well-being represents an ongoing concern for their father and extended family, who must navigate the public's continued interest in their family's story. Perhaps most importantly, Peaches Geldof's story serves as a reminder that behind every celebrity tragedy is a real person whose life had value beyond their entertainment value to others. Her death challenges us to examine not just the individuals who struggle with addiction and mental illness, but the social systems and cultural attitudes that create the conditions where such tragedies become more likely. The bright young woman who once promised to live life on her own terms deserved better than the fate that ultimately claimed her. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we consume celebrity culture and what responsibility we bear for the well-being of the people who provide our entertainment. In remembering Peaches Geldof, we honor not just her memory but our commitment to creating a world where talent and vulnerability are protected rather than exploited. The farmhouse in Kent where she spent her final years stands as a monument to both her attempts at redemption and the ultimate futility of trying to escape inherited patterns of destruction without adequate support and treatment. What hidden secrets might still remain untold about the pressures that drove her back to the addiction that killed her mother? And how many other young people might we save if we truly learn from the lessons her tragedy was meant to teach us?